Alright, guys, welcome to our end of the year review. We have finished covering new content for the year, and we're going to begin reviewing content from earlier. We're going to skip over Age of Discovery. We've done that a couple of times now. I'm pretty confident y'all have got the gist of that. We're going to pick up with early colonialism. This being the first British, French, and Dutch settlers to come to what is known as the New World. We're going to start with Jamestown in Virginia. So the charter of the Virginia Company has one very important thing that you're going to need to remember. It guaranteed colonists the same rights of Englishmen as if they had stayed in England. That is very important. Remember, up to this point in the other nations of the world, if you moved to their settlement, then you lost your rights as a citizen. You had a different set of rights as a settler, which weren't nearly as nice as the ones you have at home. This was done to encourage people to settle in the New World. So England's going to plant the Jamestown seedling in late 1606. They're going to send out 3 ships. Now, that's a poor time to send a ship. They're in the winter. Winter storms are not pleasant on the Atlantic Ocean. Uh, but they will eventually arrive at what becomes Virginia on May 24th of 1607. About 100 colonists, who are all men. I didn't think that one out, did they? You can't establish a town with only men, can you? But they're going to land at what becomes the site of Jamestown, which is along the banks of the James River, named for, of course, King James. It was a very easy to defend spot, but it is swarming with disease-causing mosquitoes, which is going to come back to quite literally bite them in the butt. That's what the fort looked like. You can see by the orientation of the fort that they were much more concerned with defending from the water than from land. In hindsight, that may not have been the best decision. After all, we now know there were lots of native peoples who lived there. There were not a whole lot of threats from the sea. So this begins the time we refer to as the Jamestown Nightmare. Of course, during that first voyage, 40 people are going to die before they even get there. Only 100 arrive, so 40 out of 140. Ugh, that's like 40%, 50%, not 50%, 35, 40%. It's not a good number to start off with. In 1609, another ship is sent from England, but its leaders are going to die, and you're going to lose all supplies when it shipwrecks off of Bermuda. Of course, they're already way off course if they end up in Bermuda. That is down in near Florida. So they probably weren't going to get there anyway. Uh, Meanwhile, settlers are dying by the dozens because of infection, starvation, Indian attacks. And now remember, they only started with 100. Dying by the dozens? That's not good. So why were they dying? The gentlemen colonists, they wouldn't work themselves. They were used to a life of being pampered back home in London and in the other major towns of England. And they weren't prepared to having to do the work themselves. And they were too busy looking for gold instead of hunting or farming. Now, have you ever heard a story about a gold rush in Virginia? No, no. And now, if they were actually looking for gold by digging mines, I might forgive them. But no, they were just walking up and down the beaches looking for gold that's just laying out there. That's not how gold works, folks. These were not the sharpest tools in the shed. So the man who's going to end up in charge is this Captain John Smith. And you've got to ask, was he the right man for the job? Probably he was. And that's because he was the exception. He cared about surviving. He did not like this whole gold nonsense. Yeah, he writes in his diary that there was no talk but dig gold, wash gold, refine gold, load gold. Well, he realized that there was no gold. We were gonna have to do other things to stay alive. We're gonna take a moment to discuss the Pocahontas myth. I've mentioned this to y'all before. Disney lied to you. Remember, look back at the picture. Does that look like the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, beautiful John Smith that's in the movie? No. This is an angry mercenary with a bushy beard, long curly hair, and eyes that aren't exactly symmetrical. Pocahontas? Well, there you go. There's an engraving from her trip to London in 1616. Don't think she looks a whole lot like the Disney movie either. So, just goes to show you, take your myths at face value. Um, the whole myth of Pocahontas saving Captain John Smith, if you'll recall, that was probably actually all ceremonial. He was probably not actually in any danger of being killed by the Braves. It was all just to symbolize him dying and joining the tribe to allow them to do trade negotiations. So let's talk more about the Nightmare of Jamestown, the high mortality rates, and what we call the starving time. Starving time starts in 1607 with 104 colonists. By the next spring, so in May we had 104, the following spring we are down to 38. That's not good. Now it's going to get a little better. In 1609 we'll get 300 more immigrants. By the spring of 1610 we drop down to 60. People are dropping like flies. It's not good. Over the course of 14 years, from 1610 to 1624, 10,000 people are going to immigrate to Jamestown. 10,000. At the end of 1624, the population 1,200. That's not good, folks. That's not good at all. Just a little over 10% of the people who immigrated to Jamestown survived. The adult life expectancy was 40 years. Children under the age of 5, 80% of them died. That's a horrible mortality rate. So let's talk a little bit about the native peoples, and specifically Chief Powhatan. He was the leader of the Powhatan Confederacy. Uh, Now, Powhatan is not what they called themselves. Uh, Powhatan was the name of the chief, and us being white people, we decided that we're just going to name all of these people after the guy who leads them. But he's going to dominate a few dozen small tribes in the James River area when the English first arrive. And he's going to be the one they're interacting with the most. But it's going to lead to some culture clash. Relations between Indians and settlers are going to grow worse and worse as the years go on. Part of it is a general mistrust because of different cultures and languages, but it's also because the English decided to raid Indian food supplies during the starving times. And that leads to what we call the First Anglo-Powhatan War from 1610 to 1614. Uh, this man named De La Warr was put in charge of the war effort, and he had these orders to make war on the Indians. Now, how did he do it? He raided villages, he burned houses, he took supplies, and he burned the cornfields. I don't know if y'all could hear me facepalm right there, but I did. You are starving. Your people are starving. What do cornfields grow? Corn. Can you eat corn? Yes. Why did you burn the cornfields? I've said it before. I'll say it again. English colonists are stupid. So, after the First Powhatan War and the inevitable end of it, the Powhatans are kind of beaten. Don't have the boomsticks. But eventually it leads to the Powhatan Uprising of 1622. This is an artist's depiction. It shows the native man brutally murdering uh, the people of Jamestown. Don't know that it happened this way. There were some skirmishes, there were some fights, they were upset about being pushed off of their land and having their stuff stolen. So it dies down again for another 20 years or so, until 1644, when the Second Anglo-Powhatan War happens. This was the last effort of the natives to try and push the English out for good. But once again, they are defeated, which leads to the Peace Treaty of 1646, that removes the Powhatans from their original land, formally separates Indian and English settlement areas, uh, and kind of leads to an end of the conflict right here for a while. Let's talk about this man, John Rolfe, for a minute. He's going to be a man who finally answers the question of what will make the colony prosperous, and that's by finding tobacco. Tobacco becomes Virginia's gold and silver, and John Rolfe calls it that in his diary. Uh, but it also is going to lead to a couple of things along the lines of indentured servitude. And it led to something we call the headright system. Each wealthy Virginian who was already there would get 50 acres for each person whose passage they paid. So you paid to bring somebody over from England, you would get 50 acres of land. Now, the people whose passage were paid, they had to sign an indenture contract. It had a term of between 5 and 7 years, and you were promised freedom dues. Your freedom dues were either land or money, uh, or a combination of the two. Usually, you would get a little bit of land, you would get a little bit of money once you finished your contract. Now, for the duration of the contract, you were forbidden to marry because your new master took care of your food and board and didn't want to take care of a family. So you were forbidden to marry. Now, from 1610 to 1614, only 1 in 10 would outlive their indentured contracts. Sounds about right. Actually, yeah, that sounds exactly right with the whole 1,200 out of 10,000 survived. Period. So they stuck with the curve, but it worked out great for your landowners if their indentured servants did not live. Because if they didn't live, they didn't have to pay them or give away their land. And people are greedy. So, Virginia is known as the child of tobacco because tobacco was very important. It had a vital role of putting Virginia on a firm economic footing for the first time. But it changed Virginia's economy to a single crop and promoted the use of the plantation system, which needed cheap, abundant labor. You might can guess where this is going. It's going to lead to 1619, which becomes known as the Year of Controversy. This is where the House of Burgesses, which is our House of Representative Government in Virginia, the first representative government in the colonies, and it's going to lead to discussion of slaves. Up to this point, slaves have been a negligible issue. There's a few, but people are wanting to make plantations, and they want lots of labor for low prices. They don't want these indentured servants that they've got to give land and money to at the end of a contract. They like slaves because they are permanent. And then the other problem is land depletion. Tobacco is very hard on the land, and they were just farming tobacco, farming tobacco, farming tobacco. And when the land went bad, they'd move on to more land. Became pretty rough. That's a picture of what the House of Burgesses looks like. It still stands today. But Virginia is eventually going to become a royal colony. King James I is going to actually grow hostile towards Virginia, partially because he hates tobacco. He's known to refer to it as the stinky weed. And he distrusts the House of Burgesses, which he calls a seminary of sedition. He's not wrong. I mean, uh, it kind of set the precedent of having your own House of Representative Government in the colonies that would eventually lead to sedition in the form of the American Revolution. In 1624, he's going to revoke the charter of the now bankrupt Virginia Company, and then it will become a royal colony under his direct control. So let's talk about the first French and Dutch colonies, uh, kind of going along with the earlier settlers we just talked about. Let's talk about the French. French exploration begins as a search for the Northwest Passage. Why are we looking for a Northwest Passage? Because it is a shorter and faster route to Asia than going around South America or Africa. The idea being if you can get to China or the other Asian countries faster, you can make more money. So, we're going to talk about Henry Hudson. He is an English explorer who was hired by the Dutch in 1609. So, a couple years after Jamestown. And he's going to end up sailing 150 miles up the modern day Hudson River in New York and until he's beached in shallow water. That's the most notable thing that he does. But he's going to begin mapping. Does anyone ever find the Northwest Passage? No. But they do thoroughly map the coast of North America for the first time. And we discover lots of natural resources that become critical to future exploration. So, going along with that is we're going to talk about the colonization of New France. And that first colony is going to be Port Royal, which is up in Canada. And it's going to be founded by this man, Samuel de Champlain. And he's going to found his first permanent French settlement in 1605, which is actually before Jamestown. But it's up in Canada, so we really don't care about it, honestly, because America. Uh, Then the next thing he's going to found is the colony of Quebec. It actually starts out as a trading post in 1608. It eventually will go on to be a capital and a very important city in Canada, but had very humble beginnings. So why did France decide it wanted to colonize the New World? First was to create wealth through trade, hoping to get that Northwest Passage and make more money by having control of a faster route to China. Later, it became a desire to surpass the English. They had the French and the English very much had a anything you can do, I can do better kind of vibe. They'd been fighting with each other, trying to one up each other for hundreds of years. And then there was just the general desire for adventure and fortune that fuels young people all over the world at all times. What about the economics of New France? They don't have silver, they don't have gold, but what they do have is fish and fur. Uh, that is going to be the driver of economic activity in New France. Now, this is going to be gathered by what we call the coureurs de bois, the runners of the woods. These are French colonists that lived in and worked in Native American lands. And their whole philosophy was we are just going to turn the natives into good Frenchmen. And what I mean by that is they are going to end up marrying the marrying native women, raising children, and making French native children. And that is about the most French way of doing things I've ever heard, and it was pretty effective actually. Along the way, they are going to do missionary work. They are a very Catholic nation, and they're going to try and uh, convert the natives to Catholicism. Now, they don't succeed really well, but they did have a couple of great contributions. They're going to draw maps, and they're going to write recollections of their journeys. Uh, the biggest thing as far as the modern U.S. is concerned is the colonization along the Mississippi River. While trappers are out hunting, they're going to hear tell of a mighty river called Mississippi, which is the which means in the native tongue, father of the waters. It kind of tells you how big it is. They're going to say this river is the father of water. So in 1673, Father Jacques Marquette and Louis Gillette are going to follow the river 700 miles downstream before they give up and turn around. 9 years later, Robert de La Salle is going to travel the rest of the way down the river to the Gulf of Mexico, and he's going to claim this region in the name of King Louis XIV and name it Louisiana. So you can see Louisiana, that was a huge, it's everything that is in green on this map. They claimed a lot of land. And you can also see that Great Britain had its claim on the East Coast, Spain had its claim on the West Coast. So they're needing to defend this new claim of theirs. And to defend from the English, they're going to build forts on the Great Lakes. Because that's the easiest way to get into it. They don't expect Britain to cross the Appalachian Mountains that form the eastern border. As far as the Spanish go, most of their activity is in the Caribbean Sea, in the Gulf of Mexico. So, in order to defend from the Gulf of Mexico, they're going to build Fort New Orleans. New Orleans had very modest beginning, uh, and it's going to grow to become a major trading center. Uh, Notably, in 1729, they do have a little bit of a outbreak. We call it the Natchez Revolt, which is a mixed slave and Natchez Indian revolt against French authority. So we've talked about the French. Let's talk about the Dutch. The Dutch established New Netherland in 1629. This man named Pieter Minuet is going to found a Dutch settlement on the Hudson River. He will buy Manhattan Island from local Native Americans, and this is going to become known as New Netherland. It was initially privately funded by the Dutch West India Company, and it encouraged people to immigrate in order to profit from the fur trade. This actually is going to end up being the most ethnically and ideologically diverse colony of early colonialism. They don't care who you are as long as you're going to work and make money. Pretty open minded for the time. Now, you notice both the French and the Dutch have come to capitalize on the fur trade. That's going to make them trade rivals and cause them to make alliances with Native Americans. The Dutch are going to ally with the Iroquois, and the French are going to ally with the Hurons. They're going to fight over this for many years. And with that, we're going to stop. That's a quick review of early colonialism. Next week, we'll move more deeply into English colonialism.